in the covered stone ship shed at the Piraeus, in the long dimness where harbor light entered only through the wide seaward mouth, a trireme rested on its keel blocks with the stillness of something that had been there long enough to feel permanent. The hull ran 37 meters from stem to stern. At its widest point, it measured under 6 meters across, so that from the right angle it appeared not wide so much as drawn out, a long dark line of fir and oak, narrow as a thought, that the eye followed from one end to the other and arrived at the far timber feeling the distance. The smell in those sheds was specific. Pitch, freshly worked into the waterline strakes, gave off something resinous and warm, even in shade. Stone held the cool of the water below it. Where the hull planking had been treated most recently, the surface caught what light there was and returned it dully, the way water does. Just before dark, 3 banks of oar ports ran along each side of the hull, one above the other, staggered slightly to account for the angles of the rowers within, and from the stone floor of the shed, those ports appeared as a repeating pattern of small dark rectangles, each one an opening cut through timber that had been shaped and fitted by hands working from long practice, each one placed where it needed to be with the precision of something designed to function under considerable stress and to keep functioning through weather and distance. The ship had a name. It was the Ship of Theseus, and for the Athenians who maintained it and sailed it and returned it each year to its shed at the Piraeus, that name carried a weight that had nothing to do with the wood itself. In Athenian mythology, Theseus had sailed from Athens across the Aegean Sea to the island of Crete. He had entered the labyrinth at the center of the Minoan palace at Knossos, found the creature that lived there, and killed it. The Minotaur, part man, part bull, the result of a particular kind of ancient strangeness, had been receiving tribute from Athens for years before Theseus ended that arrangement. 14 young Athenians, 7 men and 7 women, had been sent to Crete each year, or each 9 years, depending on which account one followed, and none of them had returned. Theseus changed that. He sailed to Crete, went into the labyrinth with a thread tied to his wrist that Ariadne had given him so he could find his way back out, killed the Minotaur in the dark at the center of the maze, and navigated back toward the entrance by following the thread. He returned to Athens. He came back. That return was what the ship commemorated. Not the heroism of the fight itself, though that was part of it, but the specific fact of coming back, of sailing out and being brought home again, of a story that ended with someone alive at the harbor rather than lost in the dark of a stone corridor far across the water. Athens held on to that. They held on to the ship. The credit Theseus received in Athenian mythology extended well beyond the Minotaur. He was said to have unified the scattered communities of Attica, the small settlements and village groups that occupied the peninsula surrounding Athens, into a single political body centered on the city. Before Theseus, in the mythological account, Attica was a collection of separate places, loosely associated but not bound together. After him, it was something more coherent. He was a founder in the most comprehensive sense, the man who slew the monster and built the state, whose return by ship from Crete was also, in a way, the beginning of everything Athens became. The ship that had carried him back was therefore not simply an old vessel, it was a civic object, a reliquary almost, for something the city understood itself to have come from, and so they kept it, not displayed and roped off, not sealed under glass, but kept in the active sense, maintained, repaired, sailed annually across the Aegean to the sacred island of Delos and back, returned each year to its shed, and attended to by the craftsmen responsible for its condition. The voyage covered approximately 200 kilometers of open water. Delos was a low, pale island among the Cyclades, considered in Greek religious practice to be the birthplace of Apollo and Artemis, and therefore sacred in a way that made the annual visit from Athens something more than a maritime commemoration. It was a pilgrimage. The ship that made it carried the specific religious weight of Athens's oldest story, and the city was careful about what it did and did not do while that ship was on the water. One of those careful things was this: during the period of the Delian voyage, the city suspended all public executions. Athenian law held that while the sacred ship was away from the harbor, from the day it departed until the day it returned, the city was in a state of ritual purity that forbade the pollution of death by official violence. Garlands were placed on the ship's stern before it left. Priests offered preliminary rites, and in Athens itself, anyone awaiting execution simply waited. The law was not informal or negotiable. It held. In the spring of 399 BCE, the ship had left for Delos before a particular trial in Athens reached its conclusion. The trial concerned a man named Socrates, who had been charged with impiety and corrupting the youth of the city, and who had been convicted by a jury of 501 citizens. The sentence was death. But the Delian ship had departed the harbor before the sentence could be carried out, and so Socrates waited in his cell in Athens while the sacred vessel made its slow way across the Aegean and back. Plato recorded what happened in that interval. Socrates spent the time in conversation. His friends came to sit with him, and they talked about the soul, about what might happen after death, about whether a life spent in philosophy was in some sense a preparation for dying that made the dying less terrible. Plato wrote all of this down in the Phaedo, a dialogue in which Socrates speaks at length on the last day of his life, and at the start of that dialogue, a character explains the reason for the delay. The ship to Delos, he says, has been away. They have been waiting for it to return. It returned. The execution was carried out, and the ship went back to its covered shed at the Piraeus, where the craftsmen who tended it would have examined the hull in the particular careful way of people who understood how quickly the warm Aegean worked on wood and how much needed watching if the vessel was to make the same voyage again the following year. There is something worth sitting with here before any philosophical question is raised. The ship existed in a specific place at a specific time of day. At the Piraeus in the afternoon, with the Acropolis visible 8 kilometers to the east across the flat Attic plain, its pale limestone buildings catching the late light, the harbor below would have been full of working vessels, the ordinary traffic of a major port, merchant ships and fishing boats, and the naval triremes of the fleet pulled up in their rows. Among them, in its covered shed, the Ship of Theseus rested in the shade, attended, maintained, particular, a real object with a specific weight and smell, and a surface that, if a hand were pressed against the hull planking, would feel like pitched wood, still faintly warm from the day's heat, stored in the stone around it. 37 meters of dark fur, under 6 meters across, 3 banks of oar ports on each side, their openings cut with the precision of repeated practice, a keel of harder oak below, running the full length, a hull that had been treated and retreated, planked and replanked, attended to with the serious professional care of craftsmen who knew what the Aegean did to wood and planned accordingly. The men who rowed it numbered approximately 170. They sat across 3 banks, the Thranites at the top level, the Zygians in the middle, the Thelamians lowest and furthest inboard, their oars angled outward and downward through the ports, the whole arrangement calibrated so that 170 oars could pull through the water simultaneously without interfering with one another. It was a precise machine, a trireme, not simple to operate and not forgiving of careless maintenance. It required attention continuously, not because it was fragile, but because a vessel of that design, asked to carry that many people across that much open water, earned its reliability by being worked over regularly by people who knew what they were looking for. And so the ship was worked over. Year by year, the wood that softened was replaced. The fastenings that corroded were renewed. The pitch was applied again and again to the waterline strakes. The tallow worked into the surfaces that spent time below the harbor's surface. The bronze ram at the prow inspected and maintained as the functional forward edge of the whole vessel. Each repair was a small continuity. Replaced plank was both a departure from what had been there before and an act of fidelity to the thing the ship was. Whether the ship was still the same ship after all of that, whether the trireme that sat in its covered shed in the 2nd century CE bore any genuine identity relationship to the vessel the Theseus had sailed back from Crete in a mythological past, is the question that would eventually attach itself to this particular harbor object and follow it across 2,000 years of philosophical discussion. But that question was not born in the shed at the Piraeus. It was noted elsewhere, at a later time, by a writer who observed with calm interest that the ship had already been generating this question among philosophers for quite a long time before he sat down to write about it. That writer was Plutarch. He was born around 46 CE in Chaeronea, a small city in the region of Boeotia in central Greece, and he spent much of his life writing the biographies that would eventually be collected under the title Lives, extended portraits of Greek and Roman men of importance. Each life documented with the specific combination of historical research and moral observation that was Plutarch's characteristic mode. He was attentive to detail. He noticed particular things, and he wrote them down with the care of a man who understood that the particular details were where the substance lived. His Life of Theseus was one of the lives. In it, he described the ship at the Piraeus, the preserved trireme, its annual voyage to Delos, the practice of replacing its planks as they aged, and he noted that this practice had given rise to a standing philosophical question about identity and continuity. The ship was an example, he wrote, that the philosophers referred to when discussing the problem of things that change over time. The Athenians repaired it by removing the old timbers and fitting new ones in their places, keeping the vessel seaworthy by replacing what was failing with fresh material. And because this had been going on for a long time, generations, not years, the question had naturally arisen of whether the ship at the end of all those repairs was still the ship at the beginning of them, or whether it had at some point quietly become a different thing altogether. Plutarch was writing around 75 CE. The practice he described was ancient even by the standards of his own time. The ship annual voyage to Delos had been running for centuries before he recorded it. The philosophical discussion he referenced, the use of the ship as an example by thinkers working through problems of identity and persistence, had been going on before Plutarch was born, before his father was born, before the generation his father's father remembered had grown old. He noted this without apparent surprise. It was simply how the question had been, for as long as anyone could trace it back. The harbor at the Piraeus, with the covered ship sheds at its edge, and the fleet resting in its orderly rows, and the long dark hull of the Theseus ship waiting in its particular shed at the water's margin, had been a backdrop to this question for longer than Plutarch could say with certainty. He could report that it was there before his time. He could not say when it started. What Plutarch could do, and did, in the careful way that was characteristic of him, was write it down. He set it in the context of the ship's history, the voyage to Delos, the commemorated return of Theseus from Crete, the civic and sacred weight the vessel carried in Athenian life. He described the repairs and the question the repairs raised. He noted that others before him had used the ship as a philosophical example. He moved on to other aspects of the life of Theseus because there was more to say. But the ship remained. The harbor remained. The question the harbor had been quietly generating since before anyone wrote it down. The question of whether a thing that replaces all of itself over time is still the same thing, remained too, attached to the image of a long dark hull resting in a covered stone shed at the water's edge, smelling of pitch, the Aegean light coming in through the seaward opening, the oar ports in their 3 rows along the narrow beam, the keel solid beneath it all. Plutarch wrote the ship down around 75 CE and noted that philosophers had been using it as an example for generations before him. That means the question was already old when he recorded it. It had been in the air of the harbor, attached to the particular object of the preserved trireme, for long enough that no one could say with confidence when it first occurred to someone standing in that shed, looking at the hull and thinking about what they were actually looking at. In the afternoon, when the light came in at an angle through the mouth of the shed and caught the pitched surface of the waterline strakes, the ship held still. The stone of the shed around it held the cool of the water. The harbor outside moved with its normal traffic, the ordinary work of ships coming and going, being loaded and unloaded, their business transacted and completed and recorded. The Theseus ship did not participate in that. It rested. It waited for its annual voyage, and then made it, and then returned. And each time it returned, there was slightly less of the original wood, and slightly more of the wood that had replaced it, and the question of what that meant for the ship's identity accumulated quietly at the edges of the whole arrangement, the way questions do when they are attached to things that persist across time without resolving into something simpler. The question was there before Plutarch. It was there when he wrote it down. It was there in the harbor, in the smell of the pitch, in the 3 banks of oar ports along the narrow hull, in the specific weight of 37 meters of dark fur resting on its keel blocks, in the shade of a covered stone shed at the Piraeus in the 2nd century CE. Older than Plutarch's account, older than the generation of philosophers he noted had been using the ship as an example, older than the confident recollection of anyone alive when he was writing, which was itself a long time ago, the harbor long since changed and the ship long since gone, the question still here. The trireme would have smelled most strongly of pitch on a warm day, when the attic sun heated the stone of the shed, and the stone passed that warmth into the still air inside. The pitch on the waterline planks softened very slightly in that warmth, and gave off its particular resinous smell, which was also the smell of the forests the timber had come from, the fir stands in the cooler upland regions, the oak from harder terrain, a smell of the land held inside an object built for the sea. A person standing near the hull on such an afternoon would have been aware of the sound of water moving against stone somewhere below and outside, the harbor present but not close, the shed itself quiet. The hull above them would have been very large. From directly below the midship section, the curve of the lower hull would have been visible overhead. The planking's lines following the hull form in long, even strakes that met at the keel below and spread apart and outward as they rose. The scale of it was domestic and enormous at once, the sort of object that rewards looking at slowly, that gives back more detail the longer it is considered. The craftsmen who worked on it would have known every plank, not by name exactly, but by position and condition, the specific character of each section of hull, where the wood was sound, where it had begun to soften, where a repair made 5 years ago was holding cleanly, and where the seams needed attention. That knowledge lived in hands and eyes, accumulated over the time a person spends tending the same object in the same place through repeated seasons. It was not written down, it was practiced. Year by year, the ship was made ready for its voyage. The priests and the garlands and the ritual departure, the 200 kilometers of Aegean water between the Piraeus and the pale low shape of Delos, the 170 rowers in their 3 banks, the stroke set and maintained across the open crossing, the island approached and made, and the commemorative purpose of the voyage fulfilled before the long pull back toward the Attic coast and the harbor opening and the covered shed, and then the return to rest and the assessment of what the voyage had asked of the hull and the work that followed. The same ship, or a ship with the same name and the same purpose and the same general form, carrying fewer and fewer of its original timbers as the years accumulated, depending on how one thought about it, depending on what one believed identity to require of a continuous object held in continuous care across a very long time. Plutarch did not settle the question. He noted it. He described the ship and the practice and the philosophical debate the practice had generated, and then he continued with his account of Theseus, because the question was interesting, but the life of Theseus was what he was writing. The question was already in circulation. It had been in circulation for generations, attached to the specific physical object of the preserved trireme at the Piraeus, available to anyone who went to look at the ship in its shed and thought carefully about what they saw. That is a long time for a question to remain open without becoming resolved or forgotten. Most questions either get answered or stop being asked. This one did neither. It stayed with the ship for as long as the ship existed, and it stayed with the world after the ship was gone, attached now not to a specific object in a specific harbor, but to the problem the ship had made visible, the problem of things that persist by changing, and what that persistence means. Plutarch wrote it around 75 CE. The debate he recorded was already old. The harbor at the Piraeus where the ship sat was older still. The practice of replacing the ship's planks as they aged, the patient expert, seasonal work of making old wood new so that the old thing could continue, had been going on long enough that no one could say with certainty when it began, only that it was still going when Plutarch noticed it, and that the question it raised had been going even longer. In the shed at the Piraeus, in the still warm air, the dark hull rested, 37 meters long, under 6 meters across, the pitch cool now as the afternoon light pulled back from the shed's opening, and the harbor outside settled into its evening quiet. The oar ports in their 3 rows along the narrow beam, each one an opening into the darkness inside the hull, where the ribs curved and the keel ran straight from one end to the other. The ship of Theseus, tended and maintained and kept seaworthy for a voyage. It made once a year across the Aegean to an island 200 kilometers away, its identity a question that philosophers had been holding up and examining and turning over for longer than Plutarch could trace back. The question older than the man who wrote it down, older than the harbor where it rested, old in the way that certain questions are old, not because they have been answered and the answer forgotten, but because the thing they ask about was always, quietly, worth asking about. A freshly cut furrier plank has a particular smell. It is not sharp, exactly, more like the memory of something sharp, a resinous, slightly sweet scent that fills the space around it and clings to the hands of anyone who lifts it. The plank a craftsman at the Piraeus holds up to the light on a particular morning is pale, almost cream-colored, its surface still showing the fine bright marks of the adze that shaped it. Against the dark weathered timber of the hull it will soon join. The new wood looks almost like a different material entirely, which in a sense that matters to the man assessing it, it is. He runs a hand along its grain before he does anything else. The grain of good fir runs long and close, and a craftsman who knows his timber can feel the difference between a plank that will hold and one that will give trouble within a season. This one is sound. He can feel it in the slight resistance of the surface under his palm, the faint warmth of the resin still working through the wood. He sets it against the hull frame, checking the curve of the fit, leaning in close to see where light shows through between the plank and the existing timber. Where there is light, there will be water. Where there is water, there will eventually be decay. The oak of the keel, just below and inward, is a different matter. Oak is heavier. A craftsman lifting a length of it notices the difference immediately. It is denser, harder to work, resistant to the adze in a way that requires more force and more patience. But oak holds its shape under compression in a way that fir will not, and the keel of a trireme takes forces that the planking above it never quite encounters in the same way. The keel bears the ship's whole weight against the ground when she is beached, and bears the ram's impact through the water when she is at speed. So the oak stays, when it can, and the fir, when it must, goes. This was the ordinary rhythm of maintenance in the naval yards at the Piraeus, the great harbor complex that Athens had built and expanded across the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era. The yards were large. The harbor at Piraeus served not only the city's sacred and ceremonial vessels, but its military fleet as well, and the infrastructure that had grown up around the fleet was substantial and carefully organized. Among the most important features of that infrastructure were the covered stone ship sheds, long parallel structures built into the slope of the Zia Basin, their stone columns rising to support the roof above each ship's berth. The channel of dark water between the columns, just wide enough to float a trireme into position and leave it resting in cool shadow. These sheds were called nairoia. The word is sometimes translated as ship sheds or ship houses, and both translations are reasonable, because the structures were indeed something like houses for ships, protective enclosures designed not to display the vessels, but to keep them out of the weather, and more importantly, out of the water. A trireme left floating for any extended period would begin to absorb seawater into its planks. The wood would swell, grow heavier, lose speed. Over a longer period, the planking would soften and decay. The covered dry storage of the nairoia was not a luxury or a ceremony. It was the practical means by which expensive, complex vessels were kept usable across years of service. The complex at the Zia Basin housed approximately 196 vessels. To walk the length of the sheds, if one could walk through them, between the hulls and the columns, along the water channels, would have been to move through a particular kind of quiet industry, not the loud, urgent business of a ship being built, but the slower, more attentive work of a ship being kept. Craftsmen moving between the hulls with their tools, the sound of mallets, the smell of pitch being heated, of fresh timber, of the brackish water in the channels catching the light between the column shadows. The craftsmen who did this work were called nopagoi. The word means, roughly, ship fasteners or ship builders, though by the time a nopagois was working on an established vessel like the sacred trireme, his work was as much repair as construction. What he knew he had learned not from written manuals, there were none, in any form that survives, but from the craftsmen who had taught him, who had in turn learned from the craftsmen who taught them. Shipbuilding in ancient Athens was a knowledge that lived in hands and eyes, and the trained judgment of someone who had spent years working with timber and water and the specific demands of a hull designed to move fast over open sea. This kind of knowledge is not vague. It is in many ways more precise than written instruction because it accounts for the variations that no manual can fully anticipate. The slightly different grain of this particular piece of timber, the particular way this hull has settled over its years of service, the specific character of the decay that has developed in this section of planking rather than that one. A Nopagoyes could look at a plank and know, without measuring, approximately how long it had been in service and what kind of attention it needed. He could press a thumb into softened wood and judge the depth of the problem with a confidence that came from having pressed his thumb into hundreds of softening planks across a working lifetime. And there was a great deal of softening wood to assess, because the waters of the eastern Mediterranean were home to an organism that treated the hulls of wooden ships as a habitat and a food source simultaneously. Teredo nivalis is a bivalve mollusk related distantly to the clams and mussels familiar along any shoreline, but adapted to a life spent inside wood. The adult organism bores into submerged timber and lives within the tunnel it creates, consuming the cellulose of the wood while leaving behind the harder lignin framework. It is a very efficient process, and under the right conditions, warm water, year-round exposure, a plank that appears sound from the outside can, over a period of a few years, be reduced inside to something more like a network of pale tunnels than a continuous piece of timber. The tunnels run along the grain of the wood, which is part of what makes the damage so difficult to detect from the surface. A plank attacked by Teredo can look from a distance of a few feet, much as it always has. The pitch on its outer surface holds. The shape does not change. Only the pressing of a thumb or the probing of a tool reveals that what looked solid has become hollow. Ancient Greek shipwrights had no way to examine the interior of their planking at a microscopic level, but they had the practical understanding that underwater timber decayed from the inside while appearing whole on the outside, and that the only reliable test was direct physical assessment. Pressing, probing, listening for the particular sound of a mallet striking hollow timber rather than sound wood. This is why the trireme spent time beached and stored in its shed. Out of the water, the Teredo could not progress. The existing damage did not heal, but it stopped, and a craftsman working in dry conditions could assess the planking thoroughly, plank by plank if necessary, identifying what needed to come out and what could stay for another season. The decision was not always clear. A plank with some tunneling near one end might still be serviceable if the damage had not reached the joints where it connected to the frame. A plank with more extensive damage needed to come out, regardless of how well it appeared from above the waterline. When a plank was removed, the process was precise. The bronze nails fixing it to the frame had to be extracted or driven through. The caulking between the plank and its neighbors had to be cleared. Adjacent planking, if it was sound, stayed in place, and the new plank had to be shaped to fit the exact curve of the hull at that point, a curve that was not perfectly regular, that had developed its own particular geometry across the ship's history of construction and repair and use. A craftsman shaping a replacement plank was working in dialogue with the existing hull, fitting the new piece into a structure that already had its own character, its own accumulated decisions made by the craftsman who had worked on it before. The fir used for this planking was selected carefully. The best shipbuilding fir was light, straight-grained, and flexible enough to take the bending required by the hull's curves without splitting. It was also, as the craftsman knew, temporary in a way that the oak keel was not. Not temporary in the sense of careless or disposable. The fitting of a plank was as skilled and precise as any other element of the ship's construction, but temporary in the honest sense that wood exposed to water, even seasonally and with careful maintenance, would eventually need to come out. The cycle of assessment and replacement was not a problem with the system. It was the system. The underwater surfaces of the hull were treated to slow this cycle where possible. Wax was applied, pitch was applied, heated until it flowed, and then worked into the seams and over the planking surface to seal it against water absorption. Tallow was used at the waterline to reduce friction and deter fouling by marine organisms. None of these treatments stopped decay entirely. They slowed it, extended the interval between necessary repairs, gave the craftsman a little more time before the next assessment. Applied freshly before a voyage, the treated hull was sleek, dark, faintly gleaming where the pitch had not yet lost its sheen, the surface of a ship that had been attended to. Athenian naval organization kept careful track of all of this. The records that survive from the arsenal at Zea are among the more unusual documents to come from the ancient world, not histories or philosophical texts or poetry, but inventories. They are carved into stone in close-written columns of Greek letters, recording the names and conditions of individual ships with the particular attention of administrators who understood that the fleet was an expensive and precisely maintained instrument of Athenian power, and that knowing exactly what condition each vessel was in at any given moment was a matter of practical importance. The inscriptions assess ships in terms that a modern reader can recognize immediately as the language of maintenance programs. A ship is seaworthy. A ship is under repair. A ship is in need of repair. A ship is not worth the cost of repair and should be struck from the active inventory. The categories are not metaphorical. They represent actual official assessments of actual vessels made by people responsible for maintaining a fleet that Athens depended on for its security, its trade, and, in the case of the sacred trireme, its religious obligations. Reading the inscriptions or reading accounts of them produces a particular impression. These are not records of things that were permanent. They are records of things that were continuously managed, vessels in different states of an ongoing process of decay and renewal, each one an object of professional attention rather than a fixed artifact. The stone that carries the record is stable. The ships it describes were not. Each entry in each column represents a moment in a longer story, a vessel that was in one condition last year and another condition this year that would be in a different condition again next year if it survived the season's service. The specific attention paid to the condition of the sacred trireme, the ship said to be that of Theseus, would have sat within this general context of systematic naval maintenance. There is no surviving inventory entry for that particular vessel, with the clarity one might wish, but the infrastructure of assessment and record-keeping that surrounded all Athenian triremes was the same infrastructure within which the sacred ship existed and was maintained. When planks on that ship were assessed and found wanting, the process by which they were removed and replaced was the same process that the Nopagoi applied to every other vessel in the covered sheds, the same pressed thumb, the same judgment about depth of decay, the same pale new fur, plank shaped to fit the existing curve of the hull. What made the sacred trireme different was not the method of its maintenance, but the weight of its history. Other triremes were repaired because they needed to be repaired, and the record of what was replaced was entered into the inventory, and no more was made of it. The sacred trireme was repaired for the same practical reasons, but the question of what those repairs meant for the ship's identity followed the work in a way that it did not follow the repair of an ordinary military vessel. The planks that came out were the planks Theseus' sailors had once rested against. The planks that went in were not. This observation, which would have been unremarkable, applied to any other ship in the yard, became, applied to this one, a genuine question worth thinking about, and apparently one that people had been thinking about for a very long time. The hull of a trireme in its covered shed, viewed from the water channel inside, presents itself as a long rising curve from the waterline to the rail. The narrowness of the beam, under 6 meters for a ship of 37 meters in length, gives the hull an almost exaggerated narrowness when seen from close to, a shape more like an elongated blade than like the broader, rounder hulls of cargo vessels. The 3 banks of oar ports along the sides are visible as regular dark openings in the planking, their spacing precise, the ports for the upper bank angled slightly differently from those below to account for the geometry of the rowers' positions. A craftsman working on the hull inside the shed would move along it at the level of the lowest planking, crouching or kneeling to examine the strakes near the keel, standing to assess the higher ones. His work would be systematic and unhurried. There was a particular craft to assessing a hull this way, beginning at the bow, where the forward motion of the ship through the water put specific stresses on the planking, working back toward the stern, giving each plank its proper attention before moving to the next. A plank passed over too quickly was a plank that might fail at sea, which was a different kind of problem than a plank that needed replacement in the dry and controllable conditions of the shed. The keel, running the full length of the hull below everything else, was made of oak, for reasons Anopagos would have been able to explain to a student in a single sentence. Oak is harder, denser, more resistant to the compression of a hull's weight and the impact of grounding. When a trireme was beached, the keel took the weight. When the ship struck another vessel with its ram, the forces traveled back through the keel before dispersing through the rest of the structure. Fear at the keel would have been adequate for many seasons, perhaps, but not adequate for the full working life of a vessel that was expected to beach, launch, and strike many times across its service. The oak stayed because the oak was right for what the oak had to do. The bronze ram at the bow, the embolon, was another matter still. Bronze does not decay in the way that wood decays. It corrodes, slowly, but the process is far slower than the cycle of decay and replacement that affected the fur planking, and a bronze ram could, with reasonable maintenance, outlast many generations of the hull to which it was fitted. There is something particular in imagining a trireme whose bronze ram had survived through multiple complete replacements of the surrounding hull, the oldest continuous element of the ship, not its wood at all, but its metal, the heavy, dense, functional weapon at the forward end of everything. Back in the shed, after the assessment of a plank and the decision to replace it, the work of removal began. Bronze nails, in ancient trireme construction, were not driven through the full thickness of the plank from the outside. They were tree-nailed, wooden pegs supplementing or replacing metal fastenings in many parts of the hull. The joinery itself, a form of fastening, as important as the nails. A craftsman removing a plank that had been fitted in this way was working in reverse, undoing the decisions of whoever had fitted it, unpicking the joinery rather than simply pulling nails. This required care. Adjacent planks that were still sound had to be protected. The frame beneath had to be examined once the plank was out, because the decay in the plank was sometimes evidence of decay beginning in the frame as well. If the frame was sound, the new plank went in. If the frame showed the beginning of softening, if the pressed thumb found a slight give where there should have been resistance, then the assessment widened. A frame in the early stages of teredo damage might still be adequate for another season, or it might not. This was the kind of judgment that depended on the craftsman's experience, his particular knowledge of how decay progressed in this type of timber in these conditions, his informed estimate of how long the ship would next be in service before it could be brought in for the next inspection. There was no formula for it. There was trained attention and accumulated professional knowledge, and the decision that resulted from both. The new plank, once shaped and fitted, was fixed in place with the same care as the original, tree nails driven into pre-bored holes, bronze nails where the design required them, the seams between the new plank and its neighbors caulked to keep water out. Then the pitch heated and applied, sealing the new surface and blending it over time with the surrounding weathered planking. Within a season, the pale new wood would darken. Within a few seasons, it would be indistinguishable from the older planks around it. Darker, slightly worn at the edges, the pitch worked deep into the grain. A craftsman who had fitted the plank would be able to find it again by measuring or by memory, but to a casual eye, the hull would look continuous, as though it had always been that way. This was, in practical terms, the point. A hull that looked like a patchwork of different aged planking was a hull that gave a bad impression, not of age, but of poor maintenance. The visible coherence of the hull was part of what the maintenance was intended to preserve. The ship was supposed to look like itself, not like the accumulation of repairs it also was, but like a single continuous object, cared for and sound, ready for the voyage. The new planks disappeared into the hull, and the hull maintained the identity of the ship across time in the most ordinary, practical way, by looking to anyone watching from the harbor like the same ship it had always been. The Napagoi, who worked through this cycle over the decades of the ship's preservation, were not, in all probability, thinking about philosophical questions while they pressed their thumbs into softening wood. They were thinking about the depth of the decay, the quality of the replacement timber, the schedule of the next sailing, the particular difficulty of the plank near the stern that always seemed to give trouble first. The philosophical observation that accompanied their work, the observation that a ship continuously repaired, becomes at some point a ship composed entirely of different timber than it began with, was made by people at a slight remove from the work itself, by people with time to watch the process and consider what it meant. Plutarch, writing centuries after the ship's most active years of preservation, noted the paradox in his account of Theseus's life with the manner of someone reporting a well-established puzzle rather than discovering a new one. The ship had been, by his account, a standing example used by philosophers discussing the nature of identity and persistence. By his time, the late 1st century of the Common Era, the philosophical conversation had already been running for generations. The ship, or the idea of it, had already done its long work in the academies and the philosophical discussions of Athens and beyond. What the craftsmen had maintained in wood and pitch and bronze nails, the philosophers had maintained in argument, turning the same material over and over, considering it from different angles, producing no agreed resolution, but continuing to find the question generative. Among the things worth noticing in this record is the role of the material object itself. The actual ship, however much or little of its original timber remained, in grounding the philosophical debate. The question was not purely abstract. It referred to a specific thing that existed in a specific place and had a specific history that people knew. The Athenians could, if they chose, go to the Piraeus and look at the ship. They could see where the old wood was and where the new wood was, or rather, they could not always see this, which was part of what made the question feel urgent and genuine. The continuity was not obvious, it was maintained, actively and deliberately, and the question of whether what was maintained deserved to be called the same ship was a genuine question about a real object. And the inventory inscriptions cut into the stone at Zia, those careful, patient columns of names and conditions, stand somewhere adjacent to this question without quite addressing it. They record what was done and what state the ships were in. They are, in their way, a continuous narrative of change, of ships moving between conditions of serviceability, repair, and exhaustion across the years of their existence. The records do not say what the ships were, they say what the ships needed. And the difference between those two statements is, perhaps, where the philosophical interest has always lived. The stone, cut once and lasting, describes vessels that changed continuously. The writing endures because stone endures. The ships endure, or were understood to endure, because skilled craftsmen kept attending to them, kept replacing what failed with what was sound, kept the hull looking like itself, even as its composition slowly shifted beneath the surface. The record is permanent. What it records was not. And there, in that particular contrast, the durability of the inscription and the impermanence of what it inscribed is the quiet observation with which the inventory stones leave anyone who considers them for a moment, that what was written down with such care, in stone designed to outlast any individual vessel, was the ongoing story of things that never stopped changing. At Portsmouth, on the south coast of England, there is a dry dock that has held the same ship for more than a century. The hull fills the space so completely that a person standing at the waterline must tilt their head almost directly back to see where the gun ports begin. The wood above is dark, nearly black in places, where the old naval tar has been reapplied so many times across so many years that the surface has taken on a depth that is less like paint and more like shadow, settled permanently into the grain. The ship is HMS Victory, Admiral Nelson's flagship at the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, and she has been in this dock since 1922, attended to with the specific patient care that very old things require when people have decided that very old things are worth the effort. The smell at the waterline is of old oak and cold salt air and something faintly chemical, the residue of conservation work carried out in the hours before the visitors arrived. The dock is quiet in the early morning. The hull simply waits as it has waited for a long time, while the world beyond the dockyard wall moves at its usual pace. A ship of this age requires continuous attention. The iron fastenings that hold the hull together are subject to the same oxidizing processes that affect all iron kept in proximity to salt moisture, and the timber planking, even well maintained, even under cover, responds to the gradual cycling of temperature and humidity in ways that no sealant entirely prevents. Conservators have worked on Victory across the 20th and into the 21st century, assessing which planks retain their structural integrity and which have softened to the point where replacement is the only practical answer. The assessments are careful, the records are detailed, the work proceeds plank by plank, fastening by fastening, with the methodical patience of people who understand that the ship they are tending has been changing all along, and that keeping it requires accepting this and working within it rather than against it. A significant proportion of the timber currently visible on Victory's hull is replacement material installed during restoration campaigns that have extended across decades. The outline of the ship its proportions, its 3 gun decks, its silhouette against the gray English morning sky, all of these remain precisely as they were on the morning of the 21st of October, 1805. The ship that holds them is not entirely the same ship. This is not a problem that anyone at Portsmouth has failed to notice. The conservators who work on Victory are aware of the question in its fullest form, and they proceed anyway, because the question and the work are not in opposition. The question is, in a certain sense, the inevitable companion of any project this old, a shadow that moves alongside the ship wherever the ship goes, not disrupting the work, but attending it as a fixture of the situation rather than an obstacle within it. What the people who maintain Victory have settled on is not an answer to the philosophical puzzle, but something more practical, a commitment to the continuity of the thing, carried forward through each campaign of repair, each replaced plank, each refastened frame. The ship continues. The question continues with it quietly. 3 years before the Battle of Trafalgar, in the harbor of Stockholm, another famous warship sank on its maiden voyage and stayed at the bottom of the sea for 333 years. The Vasa was a Swedish warship launched in 1628, and she went down in the harbor within minutes of leaving it, before she had ever reached open water. The exact cause of the sinking was investigated almost immediately by Swedish officials, and the conclusion they reached, carefully documented and then largely forgotten for several centuries, was that the ship was top-heavy, her upper gun deck too wide, her ballast too light for the structure above it. She settled into the Stockholm harbor mud at a depth of about 32 meters, where the cold, low salinity water of the Baltic preserved her hull against the organisms that would have consumed her in warmer seas. When she was raised in 1961, after an extensive salvage operation that took several years to prepare, the Vasa emerged from the water with her basic structure intact, her hull, her carved decorations, even the gilding on her stern galleries, still faintly present beneath centuries of silt. What had preserved her externally had not, however, left her unaffected internally. The wood cells throughout the hull had lost much of their structural integrity, replaced gradually over the centuries by water held within the cellular matrix. If the ship had been allowed to dry in the open air, she would have cracked and warped and eventually collapsed. The salvage team knew this, and their solution was a long, slow process of chemical stabilization. For 17 years, the Vasa was kept continuously wet, while a substance called polyethylene glycol was gradually introduced into her timbers, replacing the water within the wood cells and providing a stable internal scaffold that allowed the cells to hold their shape as the moisture level was very slowly reduced. The result of those 17 years is a ship that contains almost entirely original material. Nearly every plank, every carved figure, every knee and frame that was present in the van when she sank is present still. Nothing was replaced. The hull that visitors walk beneath in the purpose-built museum that now houses her on the waterfront in Stockholm is the same hull that was lowered into the Stockholm shipyard in 1628 and pulled from the harbor mud in 1961. What the polyethylene glycol treatment did, however, was change the chemical composition of that original material throughout, permanently. The wood in the van's timbers is not quite the same wood that the ship's builders worked with. The substance that stabilizes the cells, still slowly migrating and interacting with the wood, still being monitored by conservators decades after the initial treatment, is a permanent addition to the material at the microscopic level. The ship retained its original matter and lost something of its original nature, a reversal of the process that typically brings the question of identity forward. Most things that raise this question change their matter while holding their form. The Vansa changed its matter while holding its form as well, but the change went inward rather than outward, invisible and distributed throughout, rather than visible on the surface. The museum that houses her is dim and climate controlled. The humidity is held at a precise level. The air carries a faint mineral smell. The polyethylene glycol treatment still present, still working slowly in the timbers, the process not entirely finished even now. The carved figures on her stern look outward from the past into the present with the mild, impartial expression of things that have been somewhere for a very long time. North of Stockholm, in Norway, the question appears again in a different form. The Fram is a ship with an unusual history even by polar exploration standards. She was built in 1892 specifically for Arctic conditions, her hull designed not to resist the pressure of pack ice, but to ride above it, a rounded, egg-shaped cross-section intended to allow the ice to squeeze the hull upward rather than crushing it inward. This design allowed the frame to survive conditions that would have destroyed a conventional vessel, and she used that capacity across 3 separate expeditions over 19 years. Under Fridtjof Nansen, between 1893 and 1896, she drifted for 3 winters in the Arctic sea ice, reaching the furthest north any ship had achieved at that point. Under Otto Sverdrup, from 1898 to 1902, she mapped the Canadian Arctic archipelago. Under Roald Amundsen, from 1910 to 1912, she carried the expedition that reached the South Pole. Between each of these expeditions, the Fram underwent repairs. Expeditions to polar waters are not gentle on wooden hulls. The ice that the ship's rounded hull was designed to survive still imposed enormous stresses on the structure, and the combination of extreme cold, seasonal immersion in seawater, and the mechanical pressures of the ice required ongoing attention to the frames and planking throughout her working life. Some of the repairs made between expeditions were substantial, not emergency replacements of catastrophically failed components, but the kind of methodical renewal that any wooden vessel in active service required, carried out with awareness of what the ship was being asked to do next. The Fram now rests in her own museum at Bygdøynes, on a peninsula in the Oslo Fjord, inside a building constructed specifically around her hull. A walkway runs above the deck, allowing visitors to look down at the ship from above, and from there the extraordinary breadth of her hull relative to her length is immediately apparent. A shape that looks more like a large rowboat than a warship, blunt and wide and low in the water in memory, if not in physical fact. Conservation assessments of the Fram have confirmed what her repair history would lead one to expect, that portions of her hull include both the original timbers from her construction in 1892 and replacement material installed during the working repairs that kept her seaworthy across her 3 expeditions. Which specific sections are which is a matter of documented record, though the record is the kind that requires active research to interpret, rather than being immediately visible to someone walking the deck. The pale Arctic light that comes through the museum's skylights falls across her broad planked deck without particular distinction, illuminating old and newer wood alike. The question the Fram raises is a slightly different version from the one the Vasa raises, and both are slightly different from the one Victory raises. With Victory, the replacements have accumulated primarily since the ship left active service, conservation decisions made after the object became officially historic. With the Vasa, the change was chemical rather than structural, original material altered rather than substituted. With the Fram, the replacements happened during her working life, made by the same people who used her for the practical purpose of keeping her functional, before anyone had decided she was historic. The ship's identity was not under particular consideration when the repairs were made. She needed to go to the pole, and she needed to be seaworthy to do it. The question came later, when she was in the museum and people began to look carefully at what remained. The ancient Athenians kept a tram for centuries and replaced its timbers gradually as they decayed, and the question they were left with, whether the maintained ship was the same ship as the original, became one of the more durable examples in the history of thinking about identity. The question, as they held it, involved a ship in active ceremonial use, its planks replaced by skilled craftsmen in response to genuine physical necessity, the replacement process ongoing and well documented, the ship's sacred status depending in some way on its continued existence as the same object it had originally been. 1987 was when a group of naval architects, historians, and classicists decided to try building one. The ship they constructed was called the Olympias, and she was built with the specific intention of finding out whether modern understanding of ancient trireme design was accurate enough to produce a vessel that could actually be rowed. The Olympias was constructed in Greece using traditional methods wherever they could be identified from the ancient sources, and her hull was planked in fir. The wood that ancient records indicate was the primary material for Athenian trireme hulls. She was tested by the Hellenic Navy with volunteer crews of 170 oarsmen, drawn from universities and research institutions, none of them professional rowers. In sea trials in the early 1990s, the Olympias achieved speeds of approximately 7.5 knots under sustained rowing, a result that confirmed the basic feasibility of the ancient performance records. The crew found the rowing position demanding and the coordination required across 3 banks of oars difficult to establish, but achievable. The ship moved across the water in a way that ancient descriptions had suggested, narrow and fast and low, the oars working in their timed sequence. What the sea trials also produced was a very rapid deterioration of the fir hull planking. The warm Mediterranean water and the mechanical stress of active rowing combined to work on the planking with a speed that surprised the researchers. The seams opened, the wood absorbed water. The repairs required between sea trials were substantial enough and frequent enough that the team found themselves generating practical data about ancient trireme maintenance in the course of simply keeping the ship usable. They had set out to answer questions about how triremes moved and how they were crewed, and they found, in the process of doing that they were also answering questions about why ancient Athenians needed to replace their ship's planks as regularly as the record suggested. The planks needed replacing because this is what fir planking in Mediterranean seawater does. The schedule of replacement was not ceremonial or arbitrary. It was the schedule dictated by the physical reality of the material in that water under those conditions. The Olympias raised her own version of the question almost from the beginning. She was a replica, not a restored original, not a maintained survivor, but a new vessel built to a historical design using historical methods. Her identity as the same kind of object as an ancient Athenian trireme rested entirely on the fidelity of the reconstruction. But as the sea trials continued and the repairs accumulated, she became something slightly more complicated. A ship whose rapid deterioration was actively producing new knowledge about the ships she was built to represent. A replica generating data about the original through the process of breaking down in the same ways the original had broken down. The repairs made to the Olympias in the 1990s were, in a specific practical sense, the same kind of repairs that the Naupagoi, the specialist shipbuilders of ancient Athens, had been making to the sacred trireme for centuries, because the wood and the water required them. There is something quietly pleasant in that particular circularity. A ship built to answer questions about the past found itself, in the ordinary course of use, becoming a fresh instance of the very phenomenon those questions were about. The damage was not incidental, it was informative. The question lived in the planking as much as in the philosophy. In London, along the south bank of the Thames at Greenwich, there is a ship that has been elevated. The Cutty Sark, a British tea clipper launched in 1869, one of the last and fastest of her kind, spent much of the 20th century in dry dock at Greenwich, preserved as a maritime monument after her working life as a cargo vessel ended. She had been a fast ship in her time. The tea trade required speed, and the clipper ships built in the 1860s and 70s were optimized for it in ways that would not survive the arrival of the Suez Canal, which opened in 1869, the same year the Cutty Sark was launched, and shortened the route to China for steam-powered ships in a way that gave them an advantage the clippers could not match. By the time she reached Greenwich, the Cutty Sark was already a record of a type of vessel and a type of trade that had been superseded. In May of 2007, a fire broke out in the ship while conservation work was in progress. A vacuum cleaner left running overnight was the identified cause. The fire destroyed approximately 60% of the original timber planking that had remained in the ship at that point. The iron frame, the structural skeleton that had supported the hull since the ship was built, survived largely intact. Much of the removable internal woodwork had already been taken off-site as part of the conservation project, and this material was not damaged. But the planking that gave the Cutty Sark her visible hull, the wooden surface that visitors had seen as the exterior of the ship, was largely gone. The restoration project that followed involved decisions of the kind that maritime heritage professionals find genuinely difficult. The surviving iron frame and keel were original. The internal structural components that had been removed before the fire were original. Some original planking had survived the fire, though not enough to constitute a hull. The question was what to do with the remaining material, how to restore the ship's form with a clear accounting of what had been lost and what remained, and what such a restoration produced at the end. The project cost approximately £50 million and was completed in the early 2010s. The Cutty Sark now stands elevated above its original dry dock on a glass and steel support structure, raised several meters so that visitors can walk beneath the hull and see the ship from below for the first time. The iron frames are visible in places. The interleaving of original surviving material and replacement planking has been carefully documented, and conservators have maintained detailed maps of which sections of the hull contain what. The debate among maritime heritage professionals about what the restored Cutty Sark represents is not a hostile one. It is the kind of debate that people with a genuine investment in a genuine question carry on carefully, with respect for the difficulty of the problem, and an awareness that the answer they settle on will matter not only for this ship, but for how similar decisions are made in future. What they are arguing about is not whether the restoration was worth doing. Most of them believe it was, but what it is exactly that the restoration has preserved. The iron frame, certainly. The documented history. The form. The purpose. The name. Whether the collection of original and replacement material that now constitutes the ship's hull retains the physical authenticity of a historic artifact, or whether the loss of the majority of the original planking has shifted the ship from the category of preserved original into the category of partly reconstructed replica is a question that the map of original versus replacement material does not by itself resolve. The map documents the distribution. It does not provide the criteria for what the distribution means. What the elevated position does, practically and visually, is make the question visible in a way that a ship resting in an ordinary dry dock does not. From below the hull, the structure of the ship is apparent, the iron frames curving upward, the planking laid across them, the seams between sections where the character of the wood changes slightly between original and replacement. The ship's form is complete. The ship's history is visible within it, if one knows how to read it. A person standing beneath the hull on a clear afternoon, with the Thames visible through the glass enclosure behind them and the slender clipper lines overhead, is standing beneath a ship that has been the subject of a long, careful, inconclusive conversation about what counts as the same thing across a gap of damage and repair. These 5 ships, the dark-hulled flagship in its Portsmouth dock, the chemically stabilized warship in its Stockholm museum, the ice-tested polar vessel in the Oslo fjord, and the replica trireme whose planks deteriorated under the same conditions as the original, and the elevated clipper with its documented interleaving of old and new, are not unusual cases. Pures with they are not edge cases chosen for the extremity of what happened to them. They are representative examples of what happens to old ships when people decide to keep them, chosen because each one presents the question in a slightly different form, and because together they suggest that the question does not arrive as a crisis or a failure. It arrives as the ordinary consequence of time and use and care. Each of these ships has had people responsible for it who cared, with specificity and knowledge, about the particular object in their charge. The Napigo's testing a plank with the pressure of his thumb and marking it for replacement was doing what the Portsmouth conservator with a timber mallet is doing in a different century with different tools. The decision the Stockholm team made to stabilize with polyethylene glycol rather than replace with new wood was a decision of the same kind as the decision Amundsen's crew made when they assessed the Fram's framing between expeditions and determined what needed repair before the next departure. Different materials, different centuries, different bodies of knowledge brought to the problem, but the same fundamental orientation toward a valued object, and the same practical recognition that keeping it means working with its tendency to change, rather than pretending otherwise. What varies between the cases is what the people doing the keeping decided to prioritize. At Portsmouth, the priority is form, the ship's outline, its proportions, its visible presence as the vessel that was at Trafalgar, maintained through whatever replacements that priority requires. In Stockholm, the priority was original material, holding on to what was actually there in 1628, at whatever chemical cost to the original nature of that material. In Oslo, the repairs happened before the question of priority had even been formally raised, made by working sailors with practical purposes, and the question of what they mean for the ship's identity arrived only afterward, when the ship was in the museum and people began to look carefully. In Greece, the replica trireme prioritized fidelity to original method and design, and found in the course of using that fidelity that it was generating new knowledge rather than simply demonstrating existing knowledge. In London, the restoration prioritized the continuation of the ship as a public object and a carrier of its own history, navigating between original material and replaced material with the documentation required to keep the history legible. None of these priorities is wrong. Each of them reflects a genuine and defensible understanding of what the ship in question is and what is worth preserving about it. What they disagree on, implicitly and without needing to resolve the disagreement in order to do their work, is the same question the Athenians were holding when they watched the planks of Theseus' ship being carried away and new ones fitted in their place. What is it that makes this thing the thing it is? Where does its identity live, if not entirely in its matter? A ship is an unusually good object for this question because a ship is defined so thoroughly by use. A painting hangs still, a sculpture stands, a building encloses space. But a ship is built for motion, for the specific physical engagement with wind and water and distance that constitutes its purpose, and this engagement is what works on it, what strains its joints and softens its planking and drives the need for repair. The question of a ship's identity arises from its use. A ship that never sailed would not need its planks replaced, and the question would not arise. It is precisely because the trireme made the voyage to Delos across 200 kilometers of open Aegean water with 170 rowers pulling against the sea that the sea had the chance to work on it, and that the planks eventually needed to go. In this sense, the question that the Athenians noticed and named is not a paradox introduced from outside the ship's existence. It is generated by the ship's existence itself, by the ordinary consequences of doing what ships do. Every voyage contributed, incrementally, to the eventual necessity of repair. Every replacement plank was the direct consequence of the ship having actually been used for its sacred purpose, carried across the water, worked against the currents of the Aegean, loaded with the weight of its crew and its ceremonial significance, and the Athenian pride invested in keeping it going. The philosophical question and the physical reality grew from the same root. The ship that raised the question was the same ship that answered it, in the only way that things answer questions of this kind, by continuing. The Olympias, in its sea trials in the early 1990s, did exactly this. It moved across the water at 7.5 knots, its 3 banks of oars pulling in rhythm, its bronze ram cutting a low white wake through the flat Aegean surface. The fur planking absorbed the water. The seams opened slightly. The repairs were made. The ship went out again. The research team documented the rates of deterioration and drew their conclusions about ancient maintenance schedules, and somewhere in the accumulation of that data, in the records of which planks had been replaced, after which number of sea trials, in the measurements of water absorption and structural stress, was a small practical echo of what the craftsmen at Piraeus had known and acted on for centuries. Working at the hull of a ship that was no longer entirely the ship it had been, and was, by every measure that mattered to the Athenians, entirely and certainly the same. That irony, the replica generating its own version of the original question through the process of being used as the original was used, is not a problem. It is the natural result of building a thing well enough and using it honestly, which is perhaps the only condition under which the question can be raised at all. A ship that fell apart immediately would not raise it. A ship that never changed would not need to. The question belongs to ships that last, and lasting requires repair, and repair requires that the question be asked, and asked again, each time a new plank goes in. In the lining of the small intestine, at this very moment, a quiet and continuous replacement is underway. The cells that form the intestinal wall complete their entire lives in 2 to 4 days. They arrive at the surface, carry out their work, and are shed, replaced by new cells rising to take their positions, with the same calm regularity as one tide following another. Nothing about this process announces itself. There is no interruption to the work of digestion, no visible sign of the turnover happening at the cellular level, no moment at which the intestine could be said to have paused and restarted. The replacement simply proceeds, one cell at a time, across every hour of a person's life. This is not a rare or exceptional biological arrangement. It turns out to be the general condition of the living body, varied in its rates and timescales, but consistent in its direction. Bone cells rebuild themselves across a cycle of roughly 10 years, so that the skeleton a person carries now contains very little of the calcium and phosphate that made up their bones a decade ago. The cells lining the lungs turn over in weeks. Liver cells regenerate across several months. The skin renews its surface layer continuously, the older cells moving outward and flaking away, while the new layer rises to replace them, the whole process completing itself in a matter of weeks. Even red blood cells, which carry no nucleus and cannot divide, are replaced by new cells produced in the bone marrow on a cycle of approximately 4 months, so that the blood circulating in a person's body today is in nearly its entirety blood that did not exist 5 months ago. The exceptions are notable precisely because they are exceptions. The lens cells of the eye are formed during fetal development and never replaced, which is part of why age-related lens clouding occurs. There are no younger cells waiting to take over. And the neurons of the cerebral cortex, the nerve cells of the brain responsible for memory and reasoning and the continuous thread of a person's conscious experience, largely persist for the individual's entire lifetime. A person carries the cortical neurons they were born with for as long as they live. Almost everything else has been quietly replaced, often many times over, while those particular cells remain. The Swedish biologist Jonas Friesen and his colleagues published these findings in 2005, and the method they used to reach them was one of the more laterally inventive pieces of scientific reasoning in recent biological history. The problem was a practical one: to establish when a human cell had been created, to assign it, essentially, a birth date, required finding some marker in the cell's chemical composition that could be used as a timestamp. Cells do not carry obvious labels, but it turned out that they do carry something that functions as one if the right external calibration event is available. Carbon-14 is a mildly radioactive isotope of carbon. Living things absorb it from the atmosphere and from food in proportion to how much of it is present in the environment at any given time. When an organism dies and stops taking in new carbon, the carbon-14 already present decays at a known steady rate, and this decay is the basis of radiocarbon dating, which can establish the age of organic material with considerable precision by measuring how much carbon-14 remains. Willard Libby developed the technique at the University of Chicago in the late 1940s and received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1960 for his work on it. What Friesen and his colleagues recognized was that carbon-14 levels in the atmosphere are not actually constant across time. During the period of atmospheric nuclear weapons testing in the 1950s and early 1960s, above-ground detonations released enormous quantities of radioactive material, and atmospheric carbon-14 levels roughly doubled in a relatively short period. When testing largely ceased after the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty of 1963, the elevated carbon-14 gradually dispersed and declined, following a measurable curve back toward baseline. This meant that the atmospheric carbon-14 level at any given year within that window was distinctly different from the level at any other year, a calibration chart that functioned for cells absorbing carbon from food grown during that period as something very close to a clock. A cell that formed in 1965 would contain carbon-14 at the elevated post-testing level characteristic of that year. A cell that formed in 1975 would contain carbon-14 at the lower level characteristic of a decade later. By measuring the carbon-14 concentration in cells from human tissue samples and comparing it against the known atmospheric curve, Frisen's team could assign approximate formation dates to the cells, and through that construct a detailed picture of when different types of tissue had been built and rebuilt. The result was a map of the body's replacement rates, more precise than any previous attempt to measure them, and the map showed what has since become a familiar summary. Most of the body is substantially younger than the person who contains it, with only a few populations of cells persisting from birth to death unchanged. The body in this light is not so different from a ship being repaired plank by plank over decades. The keel remains, the hull is renewed. The person continues. Bone cells completing their cycle across 10 years are not the only objects for which a radiocarbon measurement can function as a record of origin. The same logic applies to timber. Wood cells stop absorbing new carbon at the moment the tree is felled, and from that point, the carbon-14 already present begins its long, steady decay. A fir plank cut in the 3rd century BCE and a fir plank cut in the 19th century CE carry distinctly different carbon-14 signatures, different enough that a careful measurement can distinguish between them with confidence. This means that in any historic vessel containing a mixture of original and replacement timbers, radiocarbon analysis can produce something that functions as an inventory. This plank is original. This one is a 17th century replacement. This one was fitted in the 20th century during a restoration campaign. The practical application of this to the question of ship identity is not straightforward, because the question of what percentage of original material is required before a vessel ceases to be the thing it was named is not a scientific question, but a much older and more resistant one. What the radiocarbon dating provides is not the answer, but a precise statement of the situation. Here is what is original, here is what has been replaced, here is the distribution across the hull. The question of what that distribution means for the ship's identity remains exactly where it always was, waiting for whoever wishes to engage with it. What the technique does is remove the ambiguity about the physical facts. Before this kind of analysis was available, the distinction between original and replacement material in a composite historic artifact was sometimes clear from documentary records, and sometimes a matter of visual inspection, and sometimes genuinely uncertain. With radiocarbon analysis, the uncertainty about the material facts can be reduced significantly, leaving only the philosophical question, which, it turns out, does not become simpler when the physical facts become clearer. The Sutton Hoo helmet, to take one example, was assembled from fragments recovered from the burial site at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk in 1939. The helmet had been buried since approximately 625 CE, and the Earth had done what Earth does across 14 centuries. It had compressed, shifted, and fragmented what it held. What was recovered in the excavation was 263 pieces of rusted iron and gilded bronze, mixed with the surrounding soil, their original relationships to one another no longer immediately obvious. The first reconstruction, completed in 1945 at the British Museum, assembled the surviving fragments into a form that the conservators of the time believed to represent the original helmet. It was a careful piece of work done with the knowledge and techniques available. The result was a helmet that looked plausibly ancient and plausibly Anglo-Saxon, with its characteristic iron framework and the distinctive face mask that gives it such an immediately recognizable quality. But the 1945 reconstruction was not the final word on the matter. Over the following decade, additional fragments were identified among the excavated material that had not been incorporated into the first reconstruction, and developments in the understanding of comparable helmets from the same period, particularly Scandinavian examples, suggested that some details of the 1945 assembly might not accurately reflect the original geometry. In 1971, the British Museum undertook a second reconstruction. The helmet was carefully disassembled, the additional fragments were incorporated, and the whole was put together again with the benefit of 26 years of improved scholarship and a clearer model of what such a helmet might have originally looked like. The face that emerged from the second reconstruction was more complete than the face of the first, the brow ridge more accurately positioned, the nasal guard more precisely placed. What is left at the end of this process is an object that is, in one sense, the Sutton Hoo helmet, the artifact recovered from that specific burial site, the object associated with that king or warrior or high-status individual of early 7th century East Anglia, the thing that spent 1400 years underground and was found in 1939 and has been in the British Museum's collection ever since. And it is, in another sense, two different reconstructions separated by 26 years, each reflecting the state of knowledge available to the people who built it, the original material present in both, but organized differently each time, the gaps between fragments filled in differently, the overall shape determined by interpretation as much as by evidence. The conservator working on such an object exists in a position that is, in its own quiet way, exactly the position of the Athenian craftsman working on the ship at Piraeus. The original material is there, and it is real, and it is what the object is continuous with. The replacement material and the interpretive additions are also there, because the original material alone was not sufficient to constitute the thing. Something additional was required to hold it together, to make it legible, to give it the form in which it could be recognized and understood. And the something additional was not neutral. It brought with it the decisions and assumptions of the people who supplied it. The tools used to distinguish original from later editions have become considerably more precise in recent decades. X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy, sometimes called XRF, works by directing a beam of X-rays at the surface of a material and measuring the characteristic secondary X-rays emitted by the different elements present. Each element produces a distinctive signature, and the machine reads these simultaneously, producing a detailed account of the elemental composition of the surface being examined, without the need for physical sampling. A conservator holding an XRF spectrometer against the painted surface of a historic artifact can read, in real time, whether the paint contains lead compounds characteristic of Renaissance period white lead pigment, or titanium compounds that place the paint firmly in the 20th century. Titanium dioxide was not commercially available as a pigment before the 1920s. The result is a precise chemical map of what is original and what is not, without disturbing the surface at all. Raman spectroscopy works through a related but distinct principle, using laser light to identify the molecular structure of materials rather than just their elemental composition. Where XRF can establish that a surface contains lead, Raman spectroscopy can often go further and distinguish between different lead compounds, lead carbonate from lead sulfate, for instance, which can provide additional chronological information about when a material was applied. The two techniques are frequently used together at institutions including the British Museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the Rijksmuseum, precisely because the combination provides a more complete chemical picture than either can offer alone. What these instruments cannot do is answer the question they raise. A conservator working on a painted panel from a 16th century altarpiece can use XRF and Raman analysis to produce a map showing that 40% of the visible paint surface is original and 60% is restoration material applied at various points over the following centuries. That map is enormously useful. It tells the conservator and the curator and the institution holding the panel exactly what they have in material terms. What it does not tell them is whether the altarpiece, once restored, is the same altarpiece that was commissioned from a workshop in Bruges in 1520. That question belongs to a different register, not less real for being less measurable, but not the kind of question that has a readout. The Teredo Nivalis presents a version of this same problem that has the additional quality of invisibility. The teredo is a marine bivalve mollusk, sometimes called the shipworm, despite being neither a worm nor a ship-specific creature. It lives in salt water, it burrows into submerged wood, and it consumes the cellulose content of the timber while leaving the lignin framework largely intact. This means that a plank heavily infested with teredo can appear visually whole at its surface, the outer layer of the wood undisturbed, the pitch coating intact, while the interior has been rendered into a honeycomb of pale tunnels. The structural timber present in outline, but absent in substance. Ancient Greek shipwrights had no means of examining the interior of a plank without removing it. What they had instead was the accumulated practical knowledge of a profession that had been working in these waters for generations, and that knowledge taught them what the surface of an affected plank felt like under pressure, the specific softness, the slight give at the thumb, the way the surface no longer pushed back with the resistance of solid wood. The Naupagos running his hand along the waterline, planking of a beached trireme, was reading through the surface toward the interior by feel, using a form of diagnostic knowledge that was entirely practical and entirely reliable within its scope. He knew what sound wood felt like, and he knew what compromised wood felt like, and the difference between them was something his hands had been trained to detect through years of repetition. What the teredo does, in a sense, is produce exactly the condition that makes the Ship of Theseus question so persistent. It creates a version of the ship in which the outward appearance of continuity coexists with a progressive interior replacement. The plank that looks original has been hollowed. The material that appears to have survived has in fact been changed from the inside. The surface holds its form, while the substance beneath it becomes something else. The craftsman's replacement of the plank is not a departure from continuity, but a restoration of it, a correction of a hidden discontinuity that the visual surface was concealing. In this light, the decision to replace a teredo-damaged plank is not an intervention into the ship's identity, but a kind of maintenance of it. The plank that looks intact but is hollowed is, in the relevant structural sense, already gone. The replacement plank is not substituting for something that was working. It is substituting for something that had already ceased to function as wood. The continuity of the ship was already broken by the worm. The craftsman is closing the gap. Whether this reasoning resolves the question or simply restages, it is one of the more patient elements of the problem. The replacement plank is not the original plank. Whatever was happening inside the original plank, the atoms are different. The grain runs in a different direction. The tree it came from stood in a different part of a different forest. In the sense that matters most to the physical record, something was replaced. And in the sense that matters most to the ship's continued function and continuity of service, nothing was lost that had not already been lost before the carpenter arrived. These two descriptions are not contradictory. They are simply descriptions of different things, the material history and the functional continuity, and the Ship of Theseus question arises precisely in the space between them, where those two things come apart, which is to say, in the space where most things that persist across time actually live. Jonas Friesen's work on the replacement rates of human cells was not concerned with the Ship of Theseus question. He was a cell biologist investigating the regenerative capacity of the human nervous system, and the carbon-14 dating method was a means to an end, a way of establishing facts about cellular biology that were otherwise difficult to access. The broader resonances of the finding were not his primary concern, and the paper does not dwell on them. But the finding, once available, took on a life beyond the laboratory that a purely biological paper rarely manages. The reason is not difficult to identify. The specific combination of findings that intestinal cells are replaced every few days, that bone cells are replaced over 10 years, that cortical neurons persist from birth to death, maps almost exactly onto the intuitions people already hold about what stays constant in personal identity and what does not. The felt continuity of a person across time is associated with memory, with the persistence of learned dispositions, with the accumulated experience that shapes how a person perceives and responds to the world. All of these are associated primarily with the brain, and specifically with the neurons that do not turn over. Meanwhile, the parts of the body that people are least likely to identify with their continuous self, the intestinal lining, the blood, the skin surface, are exactly the parts that replace themselves most rapidly. This alignment may be more tidy than the underlying biology quite warrants. The cortical neurons that persist are not identical at 70 to what they were at birth. They have changed enormously in their connectivity, their chemistry, and their functional organization. And the new cells that rise to replace the intestinal lining are not strangers. They are produced by the body using the body's own mechanisms, shaped by the same genetic instructions, functioning within the same biochemical environment as the cells they replace. The continuity is not simply located in the non-replacing cells, and the replacement is not simply a substitution of the foreign for the original, but the broad alignment between cellular persistence and felt identity is real enough to have given Friesen's findings a reach well beyond cell biology. The finding also does something to the Ship of Theseus question that the ancient version of the question did not do on its own. The ancient question was posed about a ship, an artifact, a made thing, something built by human craft for human purposes. The answer to it could in principle be framed as a matter of convention or social agreement. The Athenians agreed to call it the Ship of Theseus, and so it was, because naming is something communities do, and the community's decision carries its own weight. But a human body is not a made thing in the same sense. No one agreed to call it by a continuous name. The person who wakes up in the morning is identified as the same person as the one who went to sleep, not by social agreement, but by some combination of memory, neurology, and physical continuity whose exact composition is not entirely settled. When Friesen's findings are placed alongside the Ship of Theseus question, what becomes visible is that the question applies not only to ships and artifacts and historic buildings, but to the matter of which the question is being asked, the person reading or listening, the self that carries the question. The replacement is not an event that happens to other things. It is what is happening at this moment in the intestinal lining and the bloodstream and the bone marrow of whoever is considering the matter. The question is, in a certain sense, being asked by something that is itself an ongoing answer to it. A ship needs a carpenter to do the replacing. The body does it without one. Raman spectroscopy was developed in the 1920s by the Indian physicist Chandrasekhara Venkata Raman, who received the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1930 for the discovery. The technique was named for him. For most of the 20th century, it required elaborate laboratory equipment and careful sample preparation. and its use in conservation was limited by the difficulty of applying it to large or fragile objects. The development of portable Raman spectrometers and later handheld XRF devices changed this considerably. Conservation professionals who once had to bring samples to the instrument could now bring the instrument to the object, and the objects that could be examined in place rather than in a laboratory expanded enormously. This matters to the present question because it means that the record of what is original and what is not in a composite historic artifact is no longer necessarily a matter of archival research and historical inference. It can be increasingly a matter of direct chemical measurement. The original Athenian ship had no way of recording which of its planks were original and which were replacements. The stone inventory inscriptions at the Zia arsenal recorded whether ships were seaworthy or needed repair, but not the provenance of their individual timbers. The history of which plank was replaced when and where the replacement wood came from was not the kind of information that anyone thought to preserve in a durable form. Modern conservation practice operates differently. The Cutty Sark's restoration following the 2007 fire was accompanied by detailed documentation of which timbers were retained and which were replaced, the documentation itself becoming part of the object's official record. The Fram Museum in Oslo maintains records of which portions of the hull visible to visitors are original timbers and which were replaced during the vessel's working life or subsequent conservation. The British Museum holds detailed records of the interventions made in the two Sutton Hoo helmet reconstructions, including the fragments incorporated in 1971 that had not been present in the 1945 version. This documentation does not resolve the identity question, but it changes the character of it. When the history of replacement is known in detail, the question of whether the artifact is the same thing it was acquires a specificity it lacks when the replacement history is unknown or only partially recoverable. The Sutton Hoo helmet's two reconstructions are documented. The decisions made in each are available for examination. A conservator working on the helmet today knows what was decided in 1945 and what was decided in 1971 and can evaluate those decisions against the current state of knowledge. In 1945, the conservators did not know what they would know in 1971. In 1971, the conservators did not know what a conservator working today would know. Each reconstruction was made at the limit of available knowledge and is best understood as a considered response to that limit, not a final determination, but a position held until better information became available. The helmet that sits in the British Museum now reflects the state of Anglo-Saxon studies as of the early 1970s, and it is likely that future conservators will find reason to revise it again as new comparative material is identified and new analytical techniques are applied. The helmet is, in this reading, not a static answer to the question of what it is. It is an ongoing engagement with the question, revised at intervals as knowledge accumulates, the object and the understanding of it moving forward together across time. Something similar could be said of every object that has received substantial restoration attention. The restored object is not simply the original with certain parts repaired. It is the original plus the accumulated decisions of everyone who has worked on it, each decision made in good faith at a particular moment, each one reflecting something about the knowledge and values of the people who made it, each one leaving its own trace in the chemical composition or the physical arrangement of what remains. The conservator's hand leaves its mark in the same way the craftsman's hand did, and the shipworm's, and the century spent underground. The record is not only what the object is made of, it is all of the things that have happened to it, including the things people chose to do. Frisen's laboratory in Stockholm, where the carbon-14 calibration charts hung on the wall and the samples of human tissue were prepared for analysis, was doing a version of this work in a biological register. The question being asked was not about identity, but about age. When did this cell form? How long has it been here? When will it be replaced? But the answer to those questions is, among other things, a map of continuity. The neuron that formed during fetal development and has been present ever since is, in the language of radiocarbon analysis, old. The intestinal epithelial cell that formed 4 days ago is new, and the person is both, simultaneously, the old neurons and the new blood moving through the same body. The felt continuity and the ongoing replacement coexisting without apparent contradiction, as they have every day since the person's life began. The carbon-14 clock that Friesen's team used was itself a product of human action. The Cold War testing that elevated atmospheric radiocarbon was not a deliberate contribution to cell biology, and would not have been recognized as such by the people who authorized the detonations. The clock was already running before anyone thought to use it. The thing that made it useful was the recognition, decades after the events that created it, that the atmospheric record of those years could be read backward and applied as a calibration. The instrument existed before anyone knew they had it. This is not an unusual situation in the history of science. Many of the most useful measurements have depended on calibration events that were already complete by the time anyone thought to measure against them. The radiocarbon clock is old. The light from distant stars carries information about conditions that existed before the solar system formed. The carbon in ancient timber carries a record of which year the tree was felled, that the tree itself had no means of knowing it was recording. What these measurements have in common is that they depend on something having persisted unchanged through time, a decay rate, a spectral signature, an isotopic composition, while the thing they are being used to examine has changed considerably. The measurement works precisely because the marker is stable and the object is not. The stability of the marker is what makes the change in the object legible. This is, in a way, the condition that makes identity questions possible at all. To ask whether something is the same thing it was requires there to be at least one thread of continuity against which the changes can be measured. Without any continuity, there is no question of identity. There is simply one thing and then another thing, unconnected. The question arises in the middle territory, where there is enough continuity to make the connection plausible and enough change to make it interesting, and this middle territory is where almost everything that persists across time actually resides. The bone that is 10 years old was made from calcium absorbed through food grown in soil that was in some part already ancient. The cell that forms today in the lining of the intestine carries DNA that is a copy of a copy of a copy of instructions that have been copied, with variations, for a very long time. The plank that replaces the rotten one came from a tree that was growing in the same climate, in the same kind of forest, from the same species. The material that replaces the original is rarely entirely new to the world. It is usually a rearrangement of things that were already present, organized into the same form as the things they are replacing, in order to keep the whole contained. The intestinal epithelial cells that line the gut right now are, in the terms of the question, not the cells that were there last week. But the person lying quietly in the dark, with the night around them, and the slow replacement, proceeding as it always does, is continuous with the person who was there last week, in every way that the question of identity tends to find most important. The neurons are the same. The memories are held in the same place. The self that recognizes the question is the self that has always recognized it, or very nearly always, which is close enough in the settled and unhurried register of carbon and time to count. The Sutton Hoo helmet, disassembled in 1971 and put back together with greater knowledge and additional fragments, is not less itself for having been taken apart. The conservators who worked on it were not diminishing it. They were engaging with it as carefully as they could at the limit of what they knew, adding their own layer to the record of everything that had been done to and for the object across 14 centuries and 2 reconstructions. The helmet continues in the case at the British Museum, its carbon 14 firmly dated, its face composed from the judgments of people long since gone, and the judgment of those who came after them, and the fragments that waited in the Sutton Hoo soil for 1400 years before anyone came to find them. Knowing more about its composition has made it more layered rather than simpler, and the more layered version is not less interesting than the simpler one would have been, but more. In the darkness before the ceremony begins, the only light comes from lanterns carried low along the processional path. The priests move in white robes through the night air at icy, their footsteps unhurried on the gravel, their hands steady around the objects being carried from one set of buildings to another. The 2 structures stand side by side on adjacent plots of land, the old shrine and the new one, both built to exactly the same design, the same cypress wood, the same thatched roofing, the same proportions held so precisely across so many centuries that a person standing between them in the dark might not immediately know which was old and which was new. The sacred objects travel in the procession, wrapped and enclosed, moving from the familiar rooms to the identical unfamiliar ones, and when the ceremony is complete, the old buildings will be carefully and ceremonially dismantled. This is the Shikinen Sengu, the ritual reconstruction of the icy Grand Shrine in Mie Prefecture, Japan. It has been practiced on a 20-year cycle since approximately 690 CE, which means it has been carried out more than 60 times in recorded history. Each cycle requiring the felling of new cypress trees, the training of craftsmen in techniques passed from generation to generation, and the organized effort of a religious institution that has held the same intention across more than 13 centuries. The most sacred Shinto site in Japan is therefore also a site that has no building older than 20 years on it at any given moment, and the question of what makes it sacred, what makes it continuous, has an answer that the tradition itself seems to have settled quietly and without much apparent difficulty. It is not the wood. The wood is always being replaced. It is the form, the ceremony, the knowledge carried in the hands of the craftsman, and the unbroken thread of intention that runs from one cycle to the next. What the priests carry in the procession is not precisely what was carried 20 years before, because those objects too have their own cycles of renewal. But the procession itself is the same procession. The path through the darkness is the same path. The lanterns cast the same kind of light they have always cast. The white robes have the same cut they have always had, and the gravel underfoot is the same gravel of the same approach. The buildings are new, and the tradition is ancient, and the tradition has decided that this is not a contradiction. The Shikinen Sengu does not preserve a building, it preserves a practice, and the practice, repeated every 20 years without interruption, is what has kept the shrine intact across more than 1,000 years of Japanese history, through wars and fires and social upheavals that destroyed or transformed most other institutions of comparable age. The craftsmen who build the new shrine are trained specifically for the purpose. Their education begins long before any single cycle of reconstruction, because the 20-year interval is almost exactly timed to ensure that the younger craftsmen who learned their skills on one reconstruction will be experienced masters by the time the next one begins. The knowledge does not live in any written manual, or not primarily there. It lives in the accumulated judgment of hands that have done this before, in the understanding of how cypress wood behaves as it seasons and settles, in the specific techniques for jointing and fitting that were developed for this particular kind of building and have been refined across the long sequence of its iterations. When a master craftsman teaches an apprentice the correct angle for a particular cut, both of them know that the knowledge they are exchanging was worked out by craftsmen who are no longer alive, passed forward through the same method by which it is being passed forward now. The shrine complex at Ice covers a large area, and the Shikinen Sengu involves not only the main shrine buildings, but the associated structures, the bridges, the fences, the treasure and utensil renewals that accompany it, more than 60 different categories of items renewed or reconstructed as part of each full cycle. The scale of the enterprise is considerable. It requires planning that begins years in advance, the harvesting of timber from forests, maintained in part for this specific purpose, and a coordination of religious, artistic, and practical expertise that has no exact equivalent in Western heritage practice. What it produces at the end of each 20-year period is a shrine that is both brand new and more than 1,300 years old, depending entirely on which aspect of it is being considered. In 1994, at a conference held in the Japanese city of Nara, an international gathering of heritage professionals produced a document that took this tradition seriously as a model for thinking about what authenticity in cultural heritage might actually mean. The delegates came from many countries, and they came with a problem that had been quietly building in the heritage field for decades. The dominant framework for assessing authenticity in historical buildings and artifacts had been developed largely in Europe, where the preservation of original physical material was treated as the primary criterion for genuineness. A medieval cathedral was authentic to the extent that its original stones were still in place. A historic painting was authentic to the extent that its original pigments survived. This framework had a certain logic and had produced rigorous conservation practices, but it struggled considerably to account for the Isa Grand Shrine. The NARA document on authenticity, as the 1994 conference's conclusions came to be known, was endorsed by UNESCO, ICOMOS, and ICCRUM, the major international bodies overseeing cultural heritage, and it proposed a more flexible framework. Authenticity, the document argued, could not be reduced to original physical material alone. It needed to be assessed across multiple dimensions: design, workmanship, setting, and living tradition among them. A heritage site could be authentic by virtue of its continuous practice, even if the physical material expressing that practice was regularly renewed. A site whose original stones survived intact, but whose animating tradition had been entirely severed, was, in a meaningful sense, less continuous than a site whose physical fabric was regularly replaced, but whose living knowledge remained unbroken. The delegates at NARA worked toward a definition wide enough to hold a medieval European cathedral and a ritually rebuilt Shinto shrine within the same framework of value, without requiring either to surrender what made it significant. The room was arranged with the deliberateness of a gathering, aware that what they were writing would be applied to places and practices they could not fully anticipate, and the document they produced was careful not to replace one narrow criterion with another. It listed the dimensions of authenticity without ranking them, leaving the weight of each dimension to be assessed against the specific character of the site in question. This was not evasiveness. It was an acknowledgement that the question of what makes something the same thing over time is genuinely context dependent, and that any framework that pretended otherwise would fail the things it was meant to protect. The IMO number on the bridge of a working ship is a small thing. It is a stamped metal plate fixed to the bulkhead in a position where it can be readily inspected, bearing a 7-digit number that was assigned to the vessel at the time of its construction and that stays with the vessel for the entirety of its operational life. Ownership can change. The ship's name can change. Flag state, operator, and class all can change. The hull can be substantially rebuilt. The engines can be replaced. But the IMO number does not change, and in maritime insurance law and international maritime regulation, it is this number, not the proportion of original material retained, not the persistence of any particular structural component, that defines the vessel's legal identity across time. The International Maritime Organization number system was introduced in 1987, and its logic reflects a practical answer to a question that the shipping industry encounters constantly and cannot afford to leave unresolved. Ships are expensive, long-lived, and continuously maintained. A vessel that has been in service for 30 years may retain very little of its original fabric, but the question of whether it is the same vessel for purposes of insurance, registration, and liability cannot wait for a philosophical determination of how much original material is sufficient. The law answers it with a number. The number was assigned at a moment in time. It travels with the hull, and as long as the hull is operational, it carries the number. The identity of the vessel is, for legal purposes, a matter of record rather than a matter of composition. This answer has the virtue of practicality. It does not require anyone to assess what percentage of a hull's original planking remains, or to locate the keel beneath layers of subsequent repair, or to make a judgment about whether the engines installed in the 3rd decade of service are relevantly continuous with those of the first. The number plate on the bulkhead is there, or it is not, and the history attached to that number is maintained in a registry that anyone with the relevant authority can consult. It is a clean solution to a problem that, in its more philosophical form, has occupied careful thinkers for a very long time. Whether it is the right solution, rather than merely a workable one, is a question the law does not need to answer, and therefore does not try to. What maritime law decides is not what museum conservation decides, and what museum conservation decides is not what living religious tradition decides, and none of these is exactly what folklore decides. Each domain has worked out its own answer, suited to its own purposes, and shaped by its own constraints. The answers do not all agree with each other, but they exist in the same general neighborhood of the problem, which is the neighborhood where something has persisted long enough to accumulate history, while also changing enough that the persistence is not self-evidently the same as the original thing. An axe hanging on the wall of a workshop is one kind of example. The story told about it is that it belonged to someone whose name has become attached to the tool, and that the attachment is genuine even though the handle has been replaced several times, and the head was fitted by a blacksmith a few generations after the first. The name of the owner has become the name of the axe, and the axe has become a way of keeping the name present in the household or workshop where it hangs. What exactly is being preserved is not the original wood and iron, those are long gone, but the thread of intention, the decision made repeatedly across the generations to treat this particular tool as continuous with the original one, rather than as a new tool entirely. The axe is what it is because someone decided it still was. The American folklore record carries a version of this story that was being told as early as the 19th century, attached to George Washington, and an axe claimed as his. The details of the story vary, as folk narratives do, but the core stays the same. The axe has had its handle replaced, and it has had its head replaced, and yet it is still understood by the people who keep it as the original axe. Folklorists have recognized this as a culturally significant example of how ordinary people think about the relationship between continuity and composition, not in philosophical terms, not with reference to ancient paradoxes, but through the specific practical gesture of keeping an old tool and giving it a name that says something about what they believe they are holding. The story works precisely because neither replacement seems individually decisive. One handle replacement might be unremarkable. Handles break, they wear smooth, they split along the grain, and fitting a new one is simple enough that it hardly feels like a change at all. One head replacement is more substantial, but the head is still an axe head. It does the same work, and the new head is fitted to the same tool for the same purposes it has always served. It is only when both replacements are considered together that the question surfaces, and even then, the people in the story are not troubled by it. They call it George Washington's axe. They mean what they say. They have simply arrived at a different answer than the one that would follow from counting surviving original parts. The question of what makes something the same thing has an answer in almost every tradition that has kept things long enough to notice the question arising. The answers are various. They weight different things. They reflect different understandings of what makes an object valuable, whether the value lies in the physical material, in the unbroken thread of use, in the social agreement that something is continuous, in the form that persists even as the substance changes, or in some combination of these that varies from case to case. What they share is the practical recognition that the question needs answering, that things are kept across time, and that the keeping requires some working theory of what is being kept. The rebuilt Globe Theatre on the South Bank in London arrived at a different answer than the Ice Grand Shrine, and at a different answer than the IMO number system, and at a different answer than the owner of George Washington's axe. And all of these answers have something in common that is worth sitting with quietly. The Globe was rebuilt between 1987 and 1997 on a site approximately 230 meters from where the original 1599 theater had stood. The original structure burned to the ground in 1613 when a theatrical cannon misfired during a performance of Henry VIII and set the thatched roof alight. Nothing of it survived. The site was built over and eventually forgotten, and when the location of the original foundations was finally established by archaeologists in 1989, it turned out to be partially under a Grade II listed building that could not be demolished. The new Globe was built nearby, not on the original site. The construction methods used for the rebuilt Globe were drawn from research into 16th century building practice. The oak framing was hand-hewn using green wood in the traditional way. The joints were cut without metal fastenings where historical practice indicated they should be, and the thatching was applied by specialist craftsmen using materials and techniques consistent with what is known of original Elizabethan theater construction. These choices were deliberate acts of research, each one requiring a decision about which historical sources to trust and which gaps in the record to fill with the best available inference. The builders were not restoring something that had been damaged. They were constructing something that had been entirely absent for nearly 4 centuries, guided by documentary evidence, archaeological traces, and the accumulated expertise of historians and craftsmen who had spent years thinking about how the original building had been made. What they built shares no physical material with the theater that Shakespeare's company performed in. It does not occupy the same ground. Its dimensions are close to what historical sources suggest, but cannot be confirmed against an original structure that no longer exists. It is, by any material accounting, a new building, and it is also, by wide consensus and by its own understanding of itself, Shakespeare's globe. The identity claim is maintained not through physical continuity, but through a combination of design intent, historical documentation, and the continuation of the purpose for which the original building was made. The globe was built to be a working theater, and the rebuilt globe is a working theater, and in that continuity of function, the reconstruction locates its claim to be the same place. On a clear afternoon, with the Thames running dark below and the Southwark skyline pressing in from both sides, the thatched roof of the globe catches whatever light is available and holds it in a way that is distinctive enough to have become a recognizable feature of that stretch of the river. From the Millennium Bridge, the building reads as clearly as a landmark, small in relation to its surroundings, but specific, its profile unchanged since the day the thatch was laid. Inside, the yard is open to the sky, and the galleries curve around three sides of the stage in the shallow raked geometry of the Elizabethan design. Performances happen in daylight, as they did in 1599. The audience stands in the yard or sits in the galleries, and the voices of the actors carry upward through the open air, reaching the high gallery and the open sky above it, with the same acoustic logic that determined the original design. On an afternoon when rehearsals are in progress and the visitors have not yet arrived in numbers, the theater has a quality of purposeful quiet that is characteristic of working spaces. Someone is moving props on the stage. Someone else is checking the sight lines from the upper gallery. The voices that drift up from below are reading lines, trying different emphases, stopping, going back, finding the rhythm of the verse by working through it rather than by thinking about it. The building is going about its business. The thatched roof above takes the light that comes and holds it without particular comment, and the oak timbers of the frame, which were once living wood in a forest somewhere in England, and are now the curved structure of a playhouse on the river, carry the weight of the gallery floor with the silent competence of well-fitted joinery. There is something in the ordinariness of this that is worth resting in for a moment. The question of whether the rebuilt globe is Shakespeare's globe is a question that the building itself does not seem to be engaged with, while a rehearsal is in progress. The question belongs to the critics and the heritage professionals and the people who funded the reconstruction and the scholars who debated its methods. The actors learning their lines in the yard are working in a theater. The question of whether it is the original one or a very thorough new one is not part of the work they are doing at this particular moment on this particular afternoon, and the work continues regardless. This is perhaps how most of these questions actually live, in most of the places where old things are kept and maintained and used and rebuilt. The theoretical problem of identity persists at one level of consideration, and at another level, the priests carry the sacred objects through the dark. The craftsmen fit the new planks. The ship's number plate stays fixed to the bulkhead. The axe is handed down through the family, and the name is handed down with it, and the actors learn the verse. The question is not resolved by any of this continuing activity, but the activity does not wait for the resolution either. Things are kept. The keeping goes on. The ice tradition carries something else that is worth returning to, slowly, because it sits at the center of what makes the Shikinin Sengu a different kind of answer than the ones offered by maritime law or folklore. The 20-year reconstruction cycle is not a response to damage. The shrine buildings are not demolished because they have worn out or because the wood has decayed beyond repair. By the time each cycle ends, the buildings are still largely sound. They are demolished because the cycle requires it, because the tradition is not preservation of a building, but transmission of a practice, and the practice requires that the building be made anew on the same interval that a human generation spans. The timing ensures that the knowledge of how to build the shrine does not become historical knowledge lodged in texts and drawings, but remains practical knowledge held in the hands of people who have actually done it. This is an unusual answer to the question of how to keep something intact across time. Most preservation traditions are trying to slow change, to arrest decay, to hold a thing as close as possible to the state in which it was received. The Shikinin Sengu accelerates change deliberately in order to preserve something it considers more fundamental than any individual iteration of the building. It keeps the knowledge alive by using it on a regular schedule before the last generation of practitioners dies, and the knowledge dies with them. The continuity that matters is the continuity of expertise, and the method for maintaining that continuity is to practice it continuously rather than to document it and hope the documentation proves sufficient. There are debates within the heritage field about whether this approach can be transferred to other contexts, and whether the Nara document's inclusion of living tradition as a dimension of authenticity was wise, or whether it opened a door that could be used to justify rebuilding things that should instead be preserved in their original state. These are genuine debates, and the people engaged in them are working on problems that matter considerably for how historic sites and objects are treated. The debates have not been resolved, and they continue in academic journals and at professional conferences and in the specific decisions made when particular sites or objects come up for review. The 1994 NARA conference was not a conclusion. It was a document that acknowledged the complexity of the question and tried to provide a framework wide enough to hold it without forcing a premature resolution. The flexibility it proposed was not a softening of rigor. It was an attempt to apply rigor to a problem that had been approached too narrowly and to take seriously the full range of ways that human cultures have kept things alive across time, including ways that look quite different from European conservation practice, but have proven equally durable, and in some cases considerably more so. To keep something is always to make a series of decisions about what the thing fundamentally is. The craftsman who replaces a plank decides by that act that the ship is its form and its function rather than its specific timber. The priest who carries the sacred objects in the dark from the old shrine to the new one decides that the shrine is its practice and its tradition rather than its physical fabric. The maritime lawyer who assigns an IMO number decides that a vessel is its documented history rather than its material composition. The person who keeps an axe and passes on the name attached to it decides that the value lies in the story and the intention rather than in any surviving piece of the original iron or wood. Each of these decisions is made quietly in the course of doing what needs to be done, without always rising to the level of explicit philosophical consideration. The craftsman is fitting a plank, the priest is performing a ceremony, the lawyer is filling out a registration form, the person with the axe is simply keeping what was passed to them and passing it on. The philosophical question is present in all of these acts, embedded in the choice being made, but the people making the choices are not always thinking about it in those terms. They are thinking about the task at hand, and the task at hand involves quietly an answer to a question about identity and time. The question itself has a long history, longer than any of the specific examples that have been gathered here to illustrate it. It arose in a particular form in a harbor near Athens, in a time when a certain ship was being kept for reasons that were partly religious, partly civic, and partly simply the accumulated weight of what the ship had come to mean to the city that kept it. The question that arose there was whether a ship that had been gradually replaced plank by plank was still the same ship it had been at the beginning, and the question was noted and discussed and recorded and passed forward to later thinkers who found it useful for thinking about other things, about personal identity, about political institutions, about the relationship between material substance and continuous form. The question spread outward from the harbor where it started into contexts its originators could not have anticipated, and it has continued spreading. It is still spreading. It is still spreading. It appears in debates about heritage law and museum practice. It appears in biology, in the study of how living bodies renew their own material while maintaining the patterns that make them recognizable. It appears in folklore, in the stories people tell about their old tools and their old buildings. It appears in religious tradition, in the ceremonies through which sacred objects and sacred places are renewed without losing the thread of what makes them sacred. It appears in everyday life, in the quiet decisions made by anyone who has kept something old in good repair for long enough that the question of how much of the original thing remains is no longer entirely clear. The question is not one that tends toward resolution. It generates instead a set of workable answers that each hold within their own context and give way at their edges to the adjacent context where a different answer applies. Maritime law gives one answer, the Shikinen Sengu gives another, American folklore gives a third. The Nara document tried to provide a framework large enough to hold several of these answers simultaneously, without requiring any one of them to displace the others. This is probably the most honest response available to a question that is less like a problem to be solved and more like a condition to be understood. The condition of things that persist across time, changing as they persist, carrying their history in forms that are not always identical with their original substance. On the stage of the rebuilt globe, on a London afternoon that is clear enough for the daylight to do the work the original designers intended it to do, the rehearsal continues. The text being worked through is several hundred years old. The building in which it is being worked through is a few decades old. The tradition that brings actors and a text and a daylit stage and an open yard together in that specific configuration is older than any of the components that currently express it. The voices that go up through the open roof carry into the afternoon air above the Thames, and the afternoon receives them without particular distinction, the way any afternoon receives whatever happens to be going on in it. The oak of the frame holds the weight of the galleries. The thatch on the roof is a few years into its expected lifespan, and in time it will be replaced with new thatch by craftsmen who know the work, and the building will continue. The river moves past below, as it has always moved past. The city on both banks of it has been rebuilt so many times, in so many of its parts, that the question of what portion of it is original could not be answered with any precision, though the city remains itself by general agreement and with no particular controversy. The question persists underneath it all, like the water under the bridge, present, continuous, not resolved, not requiring resolution, simply there. What remains, in the end, is the practice. The priests who know how to build the shrine, the craftsmen who know how to fit the plank, the actors who know the verse, the families who keep the names attached to the tools, the registries that hold the numbers. These are the things that carry the continuous thread forward from one iteration to the next through the long accumulation of renewals that make anything persisting and present. The material changes, the form holds, the form changes.